You have always found a way to make everything about you." My mother-in-law said, her voice steady and cold as she stood just inside the front door. "David is under enough pressure without you questioning every decision we make as a family. Sign those papers tonight. It is the least you can do after everything we have done for you. If you cannot do that simple thing, then perhaps it is time we all accepted that this marriage was never going to work." "Hi, my name is Lauren Bennett. I am 29 years old. I had only been home from work for 20 minutes when my mother-in-law arrived without calling first. The papers she placed on the kitchen counter were thick, legal-looking documents that would have transferred my name off the small waterfront property David and I had bought together 2 years earlier, and moved that interest into a trust controlled by her. She spoke as if this was a reasonable request, as if refusing would be an act of selfishness rather than self-preservation. I asked her what the sudden urgency was. The property had been stable, and David had never mentioned any problem with the title or the mortgage. My mother-in-law's expression did not change. She simply repeated that David needed this done to protect the family's broader interests, and that my hesitation was making an already difficult situation worse for everyone. When I still did not reach for the pen, she added that David had been carrying far too much on his own, and that a supportive wife would not be creating additional obstacles right now. David came home an hour later. He looked tired the way he had looked for months, but when I tried to tell him what had happened, he would not meet my eyes. He said his mother was only trying to help, and that I was reading too much into a simple paperwork request. I asked him directly if there was something he was not telling me about the business or the property. He answered that I was being paranoid, and that his mother had always had the family's best interests at heart. Then he picked up the papers and carried them into his office without another word. That night, I lay awake long after he had fallen asleep. I kept turning the conversation over in my mind, trying to find the version of events where I was the one being unreasonable. I could not. The pressure to sign had felt less like a family request and more like a test I was already failing. The next morning, I called a private investigator whose name had been given to me months earlier by a colleague at the bank where I worked as a compliance officer. I had never used him before, but something about the way my mother-in-law had spoken made me want an outside set of eyes on whatever was happening. I told Marcus Hale only that I needed to understand the current state of a small family real estate venture my husband was involved in, and whether any funds had moved in ways that did not match the paperwork I had seen. He asked no personal questions and said he would start quietly. 2 days later, Marcus called with his first update. He had found a second bank account tied to the business that David had never mentioned to me. The transfers into it were small at first, then larger, always labelled as consulting fees. The receiving account was not in David's name. Marcus said he would keep digging, but that the pattern already looked like it was designed to stay off the main ledgers. I thanked him and asked him to send whatever he found next by secure email only. That same afternoon, my mother-in-law called again. This time her tone was softer, almost sympathetic. She said she understood I was under stress and that perhaps we could meet in person to talk through the papers without any pressure. I agreed to meet her at a cafe near the water the following day, mostly because I wanted to see whether she would repeat the same story once David was not in the room. When I arrived, she was already seated with a cup of tea. She smiled when she saw me, the same calm smile she had worn at our wedding. She slid a new, thinner set of papers across the table and said these were even simpler, just a temporary measure until the business audit was complete. I asked her what audit she was referring to. She waved a hand as if it were nothing important, something every small company went through eventually. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that David had been under a great deal of strain lately, and that any additional conflict at home was the last thing he needed. I left the cafe without signing. On the drive home, I received a text from David asking how the meeting had gone and whether I had finally taken care of it. I did not answer. Instead, I opened the secure email from Marcus Hale that had arrived while I was driving. The preliminary report was only 4 pages, but the third page stopped me cold. There were photographs of David having dinner with a woman I did not recognize, the same woman whose name appeared on the receiving end of several of the consulting transfers. The dates lined up with nights David had told me he was working late or meeting with his mother about the business. I sat in the car outside our house for a long time before going inside. When I finally walked through the door, David was in the kitchen, already on the phone with his mother. He looked up, saw my face, and ended the call without saying goodbye. He asked me what was wrong. I told him I had seen the report. He asked what report. I said the one that showed where the money had actually been going and who had been with him on the nights he claimed to be working. David did not deny it. He simply said that his mother had warned him this would happen if I started digging. He said she had told him I would never understand the pressure he was under or the sacrifices the family had made to keep the business alive. Then he asked me very quietly whether I was going to sign the papers now or whether I was going to destroy everything they had built. I told him I needed time to think. He nodded as if that were acceptable and went back to his phone. I went upstairs, packed a small bag, and drove to Elena Vargas's apartment across town. Elena was the only colleague I had ever mentioned any of this to, and she let me stay without asking questions that night. The next morning, I called Marcus Hale again and asked him to keep going. I also called a divorce attorney, whose name I had kept in my phone for months but had never dialed. That was the moment I realized the choice in front of me was no longer about signing or not signing. It was about whether I was willing to keep living inside a story someone else had written for me. Have you ever been told that asking questions means you don't trust the people who claim to love you? That was the question I could not stop turning over as I sat in Elena's spare room that first night, staring at the single page of Marcus Hale's report that I had printed and folded into my wallet. I kept wondering whether there was still a version of the story where I signed the papers, stayed quiet, and everything simply went back to normal. But the photographs and the bank transfers made that version feel further away with every hour that passed. The next morning, I woke early in Elena's spare room and opened my laptop before the sun was fully up. Marcus Hale had sent another update overnight, and I read it twice before I allowed myself to close the file. The pattern was clearer now. The consulting payments had been moving into an account controlled by a woman named Claire Ellison, and several of the larger transfers had been approved under signatures that matched my mother-in-law's handwriting on other documents I had seen over the years. Marcus noted that a formal business audit was already scheduled for the following month and that the irregularities would almost certainly surface once the examiners looked at the full ledger. I closed the laptop and sat with my hands around a cup of coffee Elena had left on the nightstand. I thought about calling my husband and telling him exactly what I had found. Instead, I called the attorney whose number I had kept for months. She listened without interrupting while I described the property transfer my mother-in-law had demanded and the account I had just learned about. When I finished, she asked whether I wanted to file for separation immediately or whether I preferred to gather more documentation first. I told her I needed the documentation. I did not want to move until I understood exactly what I was walking away from. That afternoon, my mother-in-law called again. This time, she did not pretend the request was simple. She said David was devastated by my refusal to sign, and that Rebecca, my sister-in-law, had been asking why I was suddenly treating the family like an enemy. My mother-in-law's voice stayed even almost gentle as she explained that families survived difficult seasons by closing ranks rather than opening old wounds in public. She added that if I continued down this path, I would be the one who forced David to choose between his wife and the people who had raised him. I asked her directly whether she had known about the second account and the woman whose name appeared on it. She paused for half a second, then said that some things were better left between a husband and his mother, and that I should focus on repairing the damage I had already caused. I did not answer. I ended the call and drove to the small office building where Marcus Hale worked. He met me in the lobby and handed me a sealed envelope without asking me to sit down. Inside were printed statements showing that the consulting account had been opened 2 years earlier, right after David and I bought the waterfront property. The largest transfers coincided with weekends when David had told me he was visiting job sites with his mother. Marcus said the audit would likely flag the account within weeks and that the examiners would almost certainly ask for explanations from everyone whose name appeared on the original business filings, including mine. I thanked him and drove back to Elena's apartment. When I walked in, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her own laptop open. She looked up and asked whether I had eaten anything that day. I told her I had not. She made a simple meal while I sat across from her and tried to decide what to do with the envelope in my bag. Eleanor did not push for details. She simply said that whatever I chose next, I did not have to decide it alone that night. Later, after Eleanor had gone to bed, I called my husband. He answered on the first ring. I told him I had seen the statements and the photographs, and that I would not be signing any papers until I understood why the money had moved, and why he had never mentioned Claire Ellison. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said his mother had warned him that I would use anything I found against the family. He asked me whether I was recording the call. I said I was not. He asked whether I had already spoken to a lawyer. I said I had. He told me that once lawyers became involved, there would be no going back, and that his mother had already made it clear the family would stand together no matter what I decided. I asked him whether he was willing to lose the marriage over the account and the woman whose name was on it. He answered that he was not the one who had chosen to involve outsiders. I ended the call without raising my voice. I sat on the edge of the spare bed and looked at the envelope Marcus Hale had given me. The pages inside represented the clearest picture I had ever had of the life I had been living for the past 4 years. I had spent those years believing that loyalty meant protecting the story my husband and his mother wanted told. The pages in front of me showed that the story had been edited long before I ever saw the first draft. The following morning, I met with the attorney again. She reviewed the statements and the photographs and said the evidence was strong enough to support a request for temporary orders if I decided to file. She asked whether I wanted her to prepare the documents. I told her I needed 1 more day. I wanted to speak with my mother-in-law face-to-face one last time before I made the final decision. The attorney nodded and said she would have everything ready whenever I called. That evening, I drove to the waterfront estate where my mother-in-law lived. Rebecca, my sister-in-law, opened the door before I could knock. She did not smile. She said her mother had been expecting me and led me into the living room where my mother-in-law was already seated. The same calm expression I had seen for years was still in place. My mother-in-law gestured for me to sit. She asked whether I had come to sign the papers after all. I placed Marcus Hale's envelope on the coffee table between us and told her I had come to ask why she had helped move money into an account that did not belong to the business and why she had never told me about it. My mother-in-law looked at the envelope but did not touch it. She said that some decisions were made to protect the people we loved and that I had never understood how much pressure David carried. Rebecca stood near the doorway with her arms folded. She said that families did not air their problems for strangers to judge, and that I was the one who had broken the trust by hiring someone to spy on them. My mother-in-law nodded and added that if I filed any papers or spoke to anyone outside the family, the consequences would reach further than I could imagine. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated that David would always choose the family that had raised him, and that I would be left standing alone with whatever story I decided to tell. I picked up the envelope and stood. I told them both that I would not be signing anything and that I would be speaking with my attorney the next morning. My mother-in-law did not stand. She remained seated and said that she hoped I understood what I was choosing. Rebecca opened the front door without another word. I walked past her and down the steps to my car. As I drove away, I realized that the choice I had been avoiding for days had already been made for me. The only question left was how much of myself I was willing to lose before I stopped trying to protect a version of my life that no longer existed. The next morning, I sat across from Sophia Grant in her small office and signed the papers she had prepared. She explained each page in the same steady voice she had used during our first call. I listened and nodded where I needed to nod. When she asked whether I wanted to request any temporary orders regarding the waterfront property, I said yes. I wanted my name removed from any future liability, and I wanted the account Marcus Hale had found frozen until the business audit was complete. Sophia made the notes without comment and told me the papers would be served by the end of the week. I spent the next 2 days at Elena's apartment packing what I could carry and arranging for the rest of my things to be moved into a small furnished unit I had found near the water on the opposite side of town. Elena helped without asking for explanations. On the 3rd day, Sophia called to say the papers had been delivered to David at his mother's estate. She said there had been no immediate response. I thanked her and hung up. That evening, my husband called. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. He asked whether I was really going to do this. I told him I had already done it. He said his mother and Rebecca were both there and that they wanted to speak with me together. I told him I would not be coming back to the estate. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said that once the audit started and people began asking questions, I would regret having involved lawyers. I told him the only thing I regretted was waiting as long as I had. He ended the call without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, the business audit began. Marcus Hale sent me a short message confirming that the examiners had requested the full set of ledgers, including the consulting account. I did not reply. I had already decided I would not volunteer any information beyond what the court required. Sophia advised me to stay silent unless directly subpoenaed, and I followed her advice. My mother-in-law tried to reach me twice more. The first time she left a voicemail asking me to reconsider before the situation became public. The second time she called from a number I did not recognize and spoke for nearly a minute before I hung up. She said the family had always taken care of its own, and that I was choosing to stand outside that circle by my own decision. I saved the message, but did not listen to it again. The separation moved forward on paper. David did not contest the temporary orders regarding the property or the account. Sophia told me that was unusual, and that I should prepare for the possibility that he and his mother were conserving their energy for the audit rather than the divorce proceedings. I nodded and signed the next set of documents she placed in front of me. I moved into the small apartment on a Tuesday morning. The unit was on the second floor of a modest building with a view of the water that was nothing like the view from the estate. I unpacked slowly one box at a time and placed the few photographs I had kept on a narrow shelf above the desk. There was no photograph of David or of his family. I had left those behind. In the weeks that followed, I returned to work and kept my routine as ordinary as possible. Eleanor checked on me every few days with a text or a quick call. I met with Sophia when she needed signatures and spoke with Marcus Hale only once more to confirm that he had turned over everything he had found to the examiners. I did not ask what the audit had uncovered. I did not need the details to know that the version of the marriage I had believed in was gone. My husband never asked to meet in person. My mother-in-law sent one final letter through Sophia's office. It was formal and brief. She wrote that the family would always be willing to welcome me back if I chose to drop the proceedings, and that some mistakes could still be repaired if I acted quickly. I read the letter once, folded it, and placed it in the bottom drawer of the desk where I kept documents I no longer needed to see every day. 6 months after I signed the first set of papers, the business audit concluded. The findings were not made public in any dramatic way. A small notice appeared in the local business journal stating that the company had agreed to a settlement with the examiners and that certain internal controls would be strengthened. I did not look for more information. I had already removed my name from every joint account and every document that connected me to the business. The waterfront property remained tied up in the separation proceedings, and I had stopped asking Sophia for updates on its status. I still saw David's car occasionally on the roads near the water. I never stopped to speak with him. Once I passed my mother-in-law and Rebecca walking together on the path that ran along the shoreline. They did not see me. I kept walking. The feeling that rose in my chest was not anger, and it was not relief. It was simply the knowledge that the circle they had drawn around themselves no longer included me, and that I had been the one to step outside it. On some evenings, I sat on the small balcony of the apartment and watched the lights across the water. I thought about the version of myself who had believed that loyalty required silence and that asking questions was the same as betrayal. That version of myself had been willing to sign papers she did not understand in order to keep a story intact. The woman sitting on the balcony now understood that some stories end not with a confrontation or a victory, but with a quiet decision to stop participating in them. I still wondered on the hardest nights whether there had been a different path that would have let me keep the marriage and the family I had tried so hard to belong to. I did not have an answer that felt complete. I only knew that the cost of staying inside their story had become higher than the cost of leaving it. That knowledge was enough to keep me from turning back. I have not spoken to my mother-in-law or to my husband since the day I left the estate. Rebecca has never contacted me. The separation remains unresolved on paper, moving forward only when Sophia files the next required document. I live alone in the small apartment near the water. I go to work, I see Elena when our schedules allow, and I have learned to spend entire weekends without anyone asking me to explain or defend the choices I have made. The peace I have now is not the kind that arrives with a clear victory or a satisfying ending. It is the quieter kind that comes from knowing exactly where the boundaries are and being willing to stand on the correct side of them, even when no one else agrees. Some days that peace feels like freedom. Other days, it simply feels like the only option left that does not require me to lie to myself. Either way, it is mine. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to choose between protecting a version of your life that no longer exists and protecting the person you are becoming, what would you have done?